Imagine for a second, um, you are making $150 billion a year. Just kind of try to conceptualize that number for a moment.
It's almost impossible to picture.
Right. You are pulling in 150 billion every 12 months. And, imagine you were doing it without working a single hour of actual labor.
No clocking in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No managing a factory floor, no emails. And the real kicker here, under the current system, the government essentially can't touch a single dime of that specific pile of money.
Yeah, it's a staggering thought experiment, honestly. And I think it cuts straight to the anxiety of our modern economic era.
Not 100%.
We live in the system where the math of wealth accumulation has become just almost incomprehensible to the average person.
And that anxiety is precisely why we are doing this deep dive today.
Hmm.
Because if you are listening to this, you are probably feeling what literally everyone else is feeling right now.
Yeah, a massive, unavoidable cost of living crisis.
Right, the grocery bills are just higher.
Mm.
The dream of buying a house feels like, well, a complete joke for most people under 40. And there is this pervasive sense that the economic engine is just fundamentally broken.
It feels rigged to a lot of people.
It really does. So today we are looking at a fiercely contested, highly polarized debate that recently exploded on Piers Morgan Uncensored. The topic is wealth, economic growth, and the billion-dollar question: who is actually to blame for the fact that you feel poorer today than you did, say, 5 years ago?
And the source material we have today is just a phenomenal lens for this, because it features a true, unvarnished clash of worldviews.
Oh, it gets intense.
Very. On one side of the desk, you have Gary Stevenson, and he is a fascinating figure. He's a former multimillionaire city financial trader who he actually grew up working class.
Right, in East London, I think.
Yeah, and he made an absolute fortune betting on economic disasters. But now he has completely turned heel on the financial sector. He calls himself an inequality economist now.
And he's built this massive audience basically arguing that the ultra-rich are functionally destroying society.
Exactly. And sitting directly across from him, you have the heavyweights of the free market defense.
The counterpunchers.
Right. You've got Christian Nimitz, who is the editorial director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, bringing very deep statistical analysis. And you also have Tom Ellsworth, a really prominent business commentator known as the BizDoc.
And the BizDoc kind of looks at the economy through the lens of corporate growth, deregulation, entrepreneurship, stuff like that.
Precisely. Now, before we really jump into the mechanics of what these three are yelling about, we have to set some ground rules for you, our listeners.
Yes, very important disclaimer time.
Because this source material is incredibly charged politically. It touches on aggressive left-wing wealth redistribution policies, and it heavily features staunch right-wing defenses of deregulated capitalism.
Right, and that means we need to state our mission clearly here. Because these topics are so explosive, our job today is strictly to decode the arguments impartially.
We are absolutely not taking sides.
None at all. We are not endorsing Gary Stevenson's call to tax the rich, and we aren't endorsing Tom Ellsworth's call for sweeping deregulation. Our only goal is to unpack the underlying economic machinery,
so that you, the listener, can understand how these competing theories actually work under the hood. We are isolating the economic engine underneath all the political rhetoric.
Because when you strip away the shouting on a talk show, you actually find some incredibly profound disagreements about human behavior, mathematics, and, the role of the state. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
The whole catalyst for this specific televised showdown was Gary Stevenson's recent documentary, How to Get Filthy Rich. And the core proposal he's pushing, his big controversial cure for the global economy, is a wealth tax.
Specifically, he wants a 2% tax on total assets for anyone worth more than $10 million.
Which is a pretty profound shift from how we normally think about taxes.
It is a massive shift. But before we can debate the logistics of a cure like a wealth tax, we have to understand the diagnosis, right? We have to figure out what the underlying disease actually is.
Are the ultra-rich maliciously hoarding all the wealth? Or is there an entirely different structural reason everyday people are struggling so much?
Exactly. And Stevenson has a very personal way of illustrating his diagnosis. He doesn't just start with a bunch of macro statistics. He actually starts with his dad.
I thought that was a really compelling framing.
It is. He explains that 30 or 40 years ago, his father worked a very standard, respectable job sorting mail for the post office. He made about £20,000 a year.
A completely normal, middle-of-the-road working-class salary.
Right. And on that single working class salary, his dad was able to buy a house, support a family, and build a life. For Stevenson, that is the baseline of what a healthy economy looks like.
And he basically contrasts that with today, pointing to two massive macroeconomic shifts that he says have completely destroyed that reality. First, he looks at the state itself.
Yeah, he points out that decades ago, governments themselves held vast amounts of wealth. He cites a figure showing government wealth at positive 100% of GDP.
Which is huge.
It is, but today, he argues, governments are effectively bankrupt. He says they are operating at negative 100% of GDP.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you there, because
Yeah.
we really need to define that. What does it actually mean for a government to have negative 100% of GDP wealth in the real world? It sounds like they basically owe more money than the entire country produces in a single year.
That is precisely what it means. It's a measure of sovereign debt. Decades ago, governments owned massive amounts of public infrastructure, public housing, utility companies. They had tangible revenue-generating assets.
So they were net creditors.
Yes. But over the last 40 years, through a combination of, privatization, massive public spending, and tax cuts, governments have essentially sold off those assets.
And so how do they fund themselves now?
By issuing debt, they sell government bonds.
And who is actually buying those bonds?
That is exactly the right question. The people and institutions with excess cash, the wealthy, corporate treasuries, foreign nations, and private banks.
Oh, wow. So the government went from owning the infrastructure of the country to basically borrowing money from the wealthiest people of the country just to keep the lights on.
Exactly. And the state pays interest on that debt, which essentially transfers taxpayer money straight into the pockets of the bondholders. Stevenson argues this is a massive systemic funnel of wealth from the public purse to the private elite.
So while the government is going into massive debt, and the working class postal worker loses the ability to afford a house, all that money didn't just vanish into thin air.
Right. Stevenson's argument is that it has relentlessly accumulated at the very top. He views extreme inequality not as an accident or a glitch, but as a mathematical certainty of the current system.
But this is precisely where Christian Nimitz enters the debate, right? And he completely rejects Stevenson's diagnosis.
Oh, he pushes back hard. Nimitz brings in the hard data to counter this whole narrative of skyrocketing, out-of-control wealth hoarding by the 1%.
Yeah, Nimitz basically looks at Stevenson and says, well, your numbers are just wrong. Nimitz points out that in the UK, the wealthiest 1% holds roughly 22% of the total national wealth.
And here is the crucial data point. Nimitz notes that this 22% figure has been almost completely flat for more than 20 years.
Wait, really? 20 years?
Yeah, that's what the data shows. And he goes even further, providing historical and international context. Nimitz argues that a 22% wealth concentration at the top is actually lower than it was for the vast majority of the 20th century.
Okay, that feels counterintuitive to how everyone feels right now.
I know, but furthermore, he points out that the UK's wealth inequality is actually lower than many other developed progressive nations right now.
So Nimitz is arguing that the underlying disease isn't the rich getting astronomically richer as a percentage of the pie. If the top 1% has hovered around 22% for 2 decades, then you can't really blame them for the sudden crushing cost of living crisis we have today.
Right. That's his logic.
So what is Nimitz's alternative diagnosis then? If it's not the rich hoarding the pie, what is it?
Nimitz argues the real disease is physical and structural. It's a catastrophic lack of housing supply. He completely shifts the focus from wealth distribution to urban planning.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he argues that the UK, and he says this applies to many major Western economies, including parts of the US, has the lowest level of housing supply in the developed world.
And he blames this on NIMBYism, right? The not-in-my-backyard phenomenon.
Exactly. NIMBYism combined with archaic planning permission laws and really aggressive local zoning regulations.
So basically, people who already own homes blocking new homes from being built to protect their own property values.
Yes. Nimitz's argument is that the economy isn't growing and ordinary people feel poorer simply because it has become functionally illegal to build anything where people actually want to live.
It makes me think of a game of Monopoly.
How so?
Well, it's like Stevenson is looking at the board, completely furious, arguing that one player has ruthlessly hoarded all the properties and is bleeding everyone else dry with rent.
Okay, I track that.
But Nimitz is looking at the exact same board and saying, no, look closely. The wealthy player has the exact same proportion of the board they had 20 years ago. The real problem is that the bank just completely stopped printing new property cards.
That is a perfect analogy. The population grew, demand grew, but the supply of houses froze. Are we fighting over a fixed number of assets, or are we failing to create new ones?
But I have to push back on Nimitz's data here, because there is a massive psychological disconnect. I mean, if you are listening to this, and you've tried to buy a home or even rent a new apartment recently, you know it feels utterly impossible.
Oh, the sticker shock is very real.
Right. So the top 1% share of wealth is statistically flat at 22%, just like Nimitz claims. Why does the wealth gap feel so incredibly extreme to the average person? Why does it feel so much worse than it did in the 1990s?
It is a brilliant question, and it requires us to look at the intersection of two critical mechanisms: stagnant real wages and skyrocketing asset inflation.
Okay, break that down for me.
The statistics Nimitz cites about the top 1% share might be technically accurate on a macro spreadsheet, but they completely fail to capture the crushing reality of an affordability crisis for the bottom 50%.
Explain the mechanism there. How can the 1% stay flat while the middle class gets so thoroughly crushed?
Think about the ratio of wages to asset prices. Back when Stevenson's father was working at the post office, let's say his home cost roughly 3 times his annual salary.
Okay, so a 3-to-1 ratio. Very manageable.
Right. It was a manageable ratio. He could save for a few years, get a mortgage, and buy in. But over the last few decades, global supply chains, automation, and the decline of unions have kept middle-class and working-class wages relatively stagnant when you adjust them for inflation.
Right, a postal worker today isn't making significantly more purchasing power than one in 1985.
Exactly. But while wages stayed flat, the price of assets, primarily real estate and stocks, absolutely exploded. So today, that exact same modest house might cost 10, 12, or even 15 times the annual salary of a postal worker.
Oh, wow. So the pie might technically be sliced in a similar ratio. The top 1% still holds their 22% of the total value, but the absolute cost of simply buying your way into the game has just completely outpaced human labor.
Precisely. The barrier to entry didn't just get higher, it became a brick wall. The working class is locked out of compounding their own wealth because they can't afford the initial buy-in.
Because they're stuck paying rent.
Yes. They are forced to rent, which means their stagnant wages are continuously transferred to the asset owners, preventing them from ever saving enough to cross the threshold. It feels worse today because the illusion of social mobility has basically evaporated.
That makes complete sense. It's not just about who holds what percentage of the total wealth. It's about the fact that human labor no longer buys physical assets.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the next and arguably most controversial piece of this debate. If the 1% didn't just maliciously hoard the assets in a vacuum, what role did the government actually play in inflating this massive bubble? Why did those houses suddenly become worth 15 times a normal salary?
And this is where we really have to examine the mechanics of government intervention, economic stimulus, and inflation, because both sides of this debate actually agree that the government messed up.
They just violently disagree on how and why, right?
Exactly. Let's start with Gary Stevenson's timeline, which is fascinating. He claims he actually started his YouTube channel back in June of 2020.
Right in the middle of the terrifying early days of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns.
Yes. And he says he started sounding the alarm because he saw exactly what the government was about to do. He predicted they were going to inject an unprecedented amount of stimulus into the economy.
He cites something like £1 trillion in the UK, right?
He does, which he calculates to roughly £20,000 for every single person in the country. And his core defining prediction was that this money would not stay with the working class.
Even if they literally handed it to them.
Right. Even if the government literally handed a stimulus check to a bartender or a retail worker, Stevenson argued that it would act as an unprecedented systemic wealth transfer directly to the rich.
And he predicted this would inevitably lead to crippling inflation and soaring prices for assets, particularly housing and gold.
Which is exactly what happened.
Now, I used an analogy for this in my notes, but I want to make sure I get the actual mechanics right. I always picture government stimulus like pouring a massive bucket of water onto a giant, multi-layered sponge.
Okay, I like that visual.
So the government pours the water on the top layer, the ordinary working people who lost their jobs during the lockdowns. But the water doesn't stay on the surface because those people have rent to pay, groceries to buy, and credit card debt to service.
So the water immediately sinks.
Exactly. It sinks straight through to the bottom, pooling in the deepest layers of the sponge. And those deep layers are the corporations, the landlords, and the people who already own the underlying assets.
The sponge analogy is excellent, but we really need to explain the exact macroeconomic plumbing of how that water sinks. Because it wasn't just stimulus checks. The mechanism Stevenson is critiquing is heavily reliant on a process called quantitative easing, or QE.
Right, combined with artificially low interest rates.
Yeah.
Okay, pretend I have zero background in finance. Explain quantitative easing like I'm 5 and how it actually transfers wealth to the rich.
Okay, when the pandemic hit, central banks panicked. They needed to keep the economy from collapsing. So they essentially created new digital money out of thin air.
They just type some zeros into a computer.
Pretty much. And they used that newly created money to buy massive amounts of government bonds and corporate debt. This flooded the financial system with cash. By doing this, they artificially drove interest rates down to near zero.
Right, so borrowing money became basically free.
Yes, but free for whom? If you are a working class person, you can't walk into a bank and borrow $50 million at 1% interest to buy an apartment building.
No, they would laugh me out of the lobby.
But if you are a massive private equity firm, a hedge fund, or an ultra-wealthy individual with existing collateral, you absolutely can.
Oh, I see.
So the wealthy borrowed billions of dollars of virtually free money and used it to buy up hard asset stocks, commercial real estate, and crucially, single-family homes.
Oh, wow. So when all those institutional investors take their virtually free government-subsidized debt and start bidding wars on residential houses, the price of a normal suburban home skyrockets.
Exactly. The stimulus didn't just trickle up through rent payments from the bottom. The monetary policy allowed the wealthy to leverage themselves massively and inflate the asset bubble from the top down.
Meanwhile, all that new money floating around in the broader economy caused consumer inflation.
Right, the price of groceries and gas shot up, so the working class saw their daily living expenses explode, which acts like a regressive tax.
While the wealthy saw the value of their newly acquired asset portfolios double.
Yes, Stevenson looked at this in 2020 and said, "This is the greatest upward transfer of wealth in human history."
That is a brilliant breakdown of the mechanics. It makes complete sense why Stevenson is so enraged. But Tom Ellsworth, the biz doc, comes at this from a completely different macro perspective.
He does. He doesn't blame the concept of inequality itself. He blames very specific, tangible, disastrous policy failures by the government.
Ellsworth points the finger directly at government fiscal policy and immigration, right?
Yes. For instance, he points to a recent Federal Reserve report noting that 7 million immigrants entered the U.S. between 2021 and 2024. Ellsworth argues this created a massive, immediate, and artificial spike in housing demand.
Which makes sense. You dump millions of new people into an economy that isn't building new homes, and rents are going to explode.
Furthermore, Ellsworth argues that the massive spending bills passed by the Biden administration, trillions of dollars in infrastructure and green energy subsidies, just poured gasoline on the inflationary fire.
So in Ellsworth's view, the government tried to micromanage the economy through aggressive spending, printed too much money, and triggered the crisis all on their own.
And to prove his point that government interference is the problem and that free markets are the solution, Ellsworth brings up a really fascinating microeconomic case study. Austin, Texas.
Yes, the Austin example is incredibly illustrative. Ellsworth goes back to 2019 and 2020. You have these massive tech giants companies like Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, and just a flood of Silicon Valley executives fleeing California.
And why did they leave? Ellsworth argues they were escaping California's punitive taxation and heavy restrictive business regulations. They pack up and move to Texas, specifically Austin.
Now, think about the mechanics of what happens to a local economy when thousands of tech workers making incredibly high salaries suddenly arrive in a mid-sized city.
It's a massive demand shock.
Huge. You have people making $300,000 a year bidding against locals who make $70,000 a year for the exact same three-bedroom houses.
The prices in Austin absolutely skyrocketed. It was one of the hottest real estate bubbles in the country during the pandemic.
But here is the crucial distinction Ellsworth makes, and it connects perfectly back to Christian Nimitz's point about NIMBYism earlier. In Austin, unlike in heavily regulated cities like San Francisco or London, the local government actually allowed developers to respond to the demand.
They didn't strangle them with decades of environmental reviews and zoning vetoes. The builders were allowed to build.
Right. The developers saw the skyrocketing prices, pulled the permits, and flooded the zone with new construction. They built apartment complexes and housing tracts at a record pace.
And what was the result of letting the free market actually operate? Ellsworth notes that the influx of new supply was so massive that it eventually overshot the immediate demand. Consequently, Austin housing prices dropped 15 to 20% from their pandemic highs.
Ellsworth uses this as empirical, hard proof of a fundamental economic law. If you have an affordability crisis and you leave the free market supply chain alone, it will eventually correct itself.
The high prices incentivize builders, the builders create supply, and the supply drives the prices back down to equilibrium.
It's a fantastic juxtaposition of worldviews. You have Stevenson viewing state interventions like Brexit as massive, self-inflicted economic injuries that weaken the nation and harm the working class.
But you have Ellsworth and Nimitz looking at aggressive regulation, zoning laws, and high taxes as the true injuries. They argue that getting the government out of the way is the only sustainable path to growth.
But we have to evaluate the durability of Ellsworth's example here, because I have to push back on Ellsworth's narrative.
Okay, let's hear it.
Is a 15 to 20% drop in one specific, highly unique, tech city definitive proof that deregulation works everywhere? Or is it an isolated anomaly? Because honestly, dropping 20% after prices went up 80% during the pandemic doesn't exactly make housing affordable for the original Austin locals again.
No, it certainly doesn't.
It just makes it slightly less outrageous for the tech workers.
That is the exact counter-argument. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Ellsworth is essentially arguing that government interference through inflation and stimulus caused the fire, and free markets, the unhindered builders in Austin, are the water that puts it out. He believes in the natural equilibrium of supply and demand.
But how does Stevenson's mathematical worldview process that Austin scenario? Because I imagine he doesn't buy the equilibrium argument at all.
He absolutely wouldn't. Stevenson would counter with the underlying math of extreme wealth concentration. He would say, sure, deregulate zoning, let the builders build 10,000 new apartment units in Austin. That's great.
Right.
But then he would point to the mechanism we discussed earlier, the compounding nature of untaxed wealth. If you have institutional investors and billionaires pulling in billions of dollars in passive income every year, they have effectively infinite capital.
Oh, wow. So Stevenson's argument is that eventually, it doesn't matter how fast you build. The people with the compounding wealth will just sweep in and buy up all the new supply anyway.
Exactly. Wall Street firms will just buy entire neighborhoods of those newly built Austin homes to use as rental properties.
Which is already happening in a lot of places.
Yes. Stevenson argues that without a structural mechanism to drain the excess capital from the top, the ultra-rich will continually outbid the working class, perpetually locking them out of ownership regardless of how many permits the city of Austin approves.
That is bleak. It's like saying, even if the bank starts printing new property cards in Monopoly, it doesn't help you because the richest player just buys them all immediately the second they hit the board.
Because their income compounds faster than the board can handle.
Which brings us to the ultimate inevitable collision of this debate. If the free market, as Stevenson views it, relentlessly and mathematically funnels money upward, his argument is that we need a forceful, systemic mechanism to take it back.
You can't just build your way out of it. You have to tax your way out of it.
And there it is, the proposed cure, the wealth tax. We need to spend some serious time here exploring the feasibility, the friction, and the sheer logistical nightmare of trying to tax wealth.
Stevenson's proposal is straightforward in its presentation. He wants a 2% annual tax on total individual wealth for fortunes over $10 million.
And he is incredibly quick to defend this against accusations of radicalism, right? He claims this isn't some unprecedented Marxist fever dream.
Right. He points to history to normalize the idea. He looks back at the post-World War II era, roughly from the 1950s through the late 1970s. He calls this the golden age of capitalism.
And he correctly points out that top marginal tax rates in places like the US and the UK hit 90% back then.
He even references the famous Beatles song Taxman, specifically noting the lyrics where George Harrison complains about the government taking 95%. 1 for you, 19 for me.
Stevenson uses this historical precedent to argue a very specific point. Aggressive taxation on the wealthiest members of society does not destroy an economy.
In fact, he argues it coincided with the greatest expansion of the middle class in history, an era where a postal worker could easily afford a home.
But we have to clarify something absolutely vital here, because Stevenson's historical example actually conflates two entirely different economic mechanisms.
Yes, it does.
The 90% tax rate in the 1950s, and the tax the Beatles were complaining about, was an income tax. It was a tax on money being earned in that specific year. But what Stevenson is proposing today is a wealth tax. Explain why that distinction is so monumental.
The distinction is everything. It is the fundamental difference between taxing a transaction and taxing a state of being.
A transaction versus a state of being. Okay, break the mechanics of that down for me.
When a government taxes income or sales or corporate profits, they are taxing a discrete, measurable transaction. An event occurs in real time. Money changes hands from an employer to an employee, or a consumer buys a coffee.
So there's a definite event.
Yes. At that exact moment, the value of the transaction is objectively fixed in liquid cash. The government simply inserts itself into that flow and takes a percentage. It is administratively very simple because the cash is physically moving.
Right, I sell a script for $100, the transaction is logged, and the government takes $20 before it hits my bank. It's clean.
Precisely. But a wealth tax does not tax a transaction. It attempts to tax a state of being, the ongoing ownership of an asset. And assets fluctuate in value every single day without any actual money changing hands.
This is where Christian Nimitz offers a severe, brutal reality check on Stevenson's proposal. Nimitz doesn't just argue against the theory of a wealth tax. He looks at the historical track record of how it actually functions in practice.
And he calls it a bureaucratic nightmare.
Nimitz argues that the sheer act of valuing illiquid assets is an impossibly complex task for a government to execute efficiently.
During the televised debate, he literally gestures around the studio they're filming in and asks, how much is this specific building worth?
Right.
If you brought in 10 different professional real estate appraisers, you would get 10 vastly different valuations, varying by millions of pounds.
And this is where it gets incredibly interesting to me from a purely logistical standpoint. Let's do a little thought experiment here. Let's say I'm worth $20 million, and that wealth is entirely in publicly traded Apple stock. That's easy for the government to tax, right?
Yeah.
They just check the stock ticker on December 31st, multiply my shares by the closing price, and boom, they know my exact net worth and can charge me 2%.
Yes. Taxing highly liquid, publicly traded securities is relatively straightforward. But billionaires do not hold the majority of their wealth in simple checking accounts or standard stock portfolios.
Exactly. What if my $20 million isn't in Apple stock? What if I am the sole owner of a private logistics company?
It gets much messier.
Right, my wealth is tied up in a fleet of 50 industrial tractors, a warehouse I bought in 1998, a proprietary software system my team coded, and a collection of obscure modern art hanging in my corporate lobby. How does the government accurately value and tax that state of being every single year?
The mechanics of trying to do so reveal why Nimitz calls it a nightmare. The government would have to force you to hire forensic accountants, industrial equipment appraisers, and art experts to submit a massive, complex valuation of your private, illiquid assets every 12 months.
And obviously, if I'm the one paying the tax, my accountants are going to use every legal loophole to argue that my tractors are depreciating rapidly, my software is obsolete, and my art collection is worthless.
Exactly. Which means the government then has to hire its own massive army of state-funded auditors, lawyers, and rival appraisers to audit your valuation and fight you in tax court.
That sounds incredibly expensive.
It is. Nimitz points out that the administrative cost of the sheer bureaucracy required to value everyone's illiquid assets almost always ends up outweighing the actual revenue the government manages to collect. It is a wildly inefficient mechanism.
And if I have all my wealth tied up in tractors, I don't actually have the liquid cash on hand to pay the 2% tax bill anyway. What do? Do I have to sell one of my tractors every year just to pay the tax on owning the other 49?
Which would literally cannibalize the productive capacity of the business.
Exactly.
You've hit on the exact reason why wealth taxes fail in the real world. And Nimitz backs this up with international data. He points out that up until the early 1990s, roughly half of Western Europe actually had various forms of wealth taxes on the books.
Really? Half of Europe?
Yeah. But almost all of them, including countries like France and Sweden, eventually abandoned them. The bureaucratic friction was too high, the capital flight was too severe, and the revenue was pitiful.
Nimitz even points out that the UK Labour government explored implementing a wealth tax back in the 1970s, but abandoned the plan for that precise logistical reason. It just doesn't scale.
Furthermore, Nimitz brings up Gabriel Zucman. Zucman is an incredibly prominent economist, currently advising political campaigns in the U.S., and is widely considered the leading global academic guru advocating for wealth taxes.
And Stevenson himself has featured Zucman's work, right?
Yes. But Nimitz points out that even Zuckman concedes that the European wealth taxes of the 20th century were objective failures.
Wow. So even the top advocate admits the history is bad.
Right. Zuckman argues we just need to tweak the design and implement them globally to stop billionaires from fleeing. But Nimitz's counter is essentially, we have seen this movie, we know the mechanics of why it fails, and it ends badly every time.
But wait, doesn't Switzerland have a wealth tax? I always hear wealth tax proponents pointing to the Swiss model as proof that it can work perfectly.
Yeah.
Nimitz does acknowledge this in the debate, right?
He does, but he adds vital context that completely changes the narrative. It is true that Switzerland raises roughly 1% of its GDP from a wealth tax, but Nimitz explains why it works there and nowhere else.
Why is that?
It only functions because the Swiss tax code is a holistic ecosystem. Their overall tax burden on income and consumption is significantly lighter than in the rest of Europe.
Oh, I see. It's a trade-off.
Exactly. It's
Okay.
a carefully balanced package deal. In Switzerland, citizens accept a modest tax on their total wealth because the state takes far less of their daily income in sales transactions.
Let's say a very different political culture, right?
Very different. The Swiss government is highly decentralized, operating at the canton level, which fosters a much higher cultural trust between the taxpayer and the state. Nimitz argues you absolutely cannot take the Swiss wealth tax and simply slap it on top of an already high-tax, high-spending system like the UK or the US.
Where the state is already consuming 40 to 45% of GDP.
Right. The economic engine would choke.
And Nimitz also rightly points out that countries like the US and the UK actually already tax wealth, just through indirect transactional mechanisms that are easier to enforce.
Yes. Stamp duty on real estate transfers, inheritance tax when a wealthy estate is passed down, property tax is paid annually, and capital gains tax when an asset is finally sold and the profit is realized in cash.
Nimitz argues these indirect wealth taxes already raise more revenue as a percentage of GDP in Britain than many OECD countries manage to collect.
By the way, for anyone wondering, the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, essentially a club of the 38 wealthiest developed democracies in the world.
So Nimitz is saying the UK already taxes wealth more efficiently than its peers. But Tom Ellsworth adds one final, deeply psychological layer of anxiety to this policy debate: the slippery slope of government power.
Yes, Ellsworth points to the political reality of how taxation evolves over time.
He notes that in California, a progressive politician named Ro Khanna is already publicly discussing pushing the threshold for a federal wealth tax down to $50 million.
And while 50 million is still incredibly wealthy, Ellsworth argues this proves a fundamental historical law of government behavior.
Once they get a taste, they want more.
Once the state builds the bureaucratic infrastructure to tax a new metric, once they get a knob to turn, as he puts it, they will inevitably keep turning that knob until it reaches the middle class.
There is massive historical precedent for Ellsworth's anxiety, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Look at the history of the income tax in the United States. When the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913 to create a federal income tax, it was explicitly sold to the public as a targeted tax exclusively on the ultra-rich. The initial rate was 1% on incomes over $3,000, which was incredibly high back then, and maxed out at 7% for the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers of the world. The vast majority of everyday Americans paid literally zero income tax.
But once the IRS was created and the mechanism was in place, the temptation for politicians to lower the threshold and raise the rates to fund their projects was just irresistible.
Exactly. Fast forward through a couple of world wars, and suddenly the income tax is a massive structural burden on the middle class. Ellsworth's warning is succinct. The good news is they're taxing the rich today. The bad news is tomorrow the government decides that you are rich.
So the logistical hurdles are massive, the historical precedents are terrible, and the fear of state overreach is very real. But this entire theoretical debate about the mechanics of taxing assets hits a massive philosophical wall when you look at how modern wealth is actually created in the first place.
That's the real core issue.
Right. What happens when the wealth you want to aggressively tax isn't just a fleet of idle tractors or a vault of gold coins, but is actively being used to build the future of humanity?
This transitions us directly into the heart of the billionaire debate. We have to unpack two deeply competing narratives about human capital. Are the ultra-rich primarily extractive hoarders, or are they generative innovators?
Let's start with Gary Stevenson's view, which he frames with a sense of genuine mathematical dread. He asks the audience to imagine a hypothetical trillionaire in the near future.
If this trillionaire pulls in what Stevenson considers a highly conservative 15% return on investment every year, that is $150 billion a year in passive profit.
And Stevenson contrasts that 15% return with the growth rate of the physical economy, right?
Yes. The overall output of goods and services in a developed nation usually only grows at 1 to 2% a year.
Right. And here's where Stevenson's mechanism of compounding wealth becomes truly terrifying. If the physical economy, the amount of land, resources, and businesses available is only growing at 2%, but a single individual's purchasing power is growing at 15%, mathematically, that individual will eventually swallow all available assets.
Stevenson views this extreme wealth accumulation as purely extractive. It doesn't create new value, it just cannibalizes the existing system.
But Piers Morgan and Tom Ellsworth vehemently reject that characterization. They view Stevenson's math as a fundamental misunderstanding of what capital actually does.
And they use Elon Musk as their ultimate real-world counter-argument to the hoarder narrative.
Ellsworth specifically walks through a fascinating chronological timeline of Musk's career to prove this exact point. It goes back to 2002. At that time, eBay buys PayPal for over $1 billion, and Musk, as a founder, suddenly becomes incredibly wealthy.
His net worth skyrockets.
Now, Ellsworth poses a hypothetical. What if Gary Stevenson's aggressive wealth tax had been in place in 2002?
If the government had stepped in at that exact moment and said, Elon, you have accumulated too much wealth too quickly. We are taking a massive percentage of your PayPal windfall in the name of equality. What is the mechanical result?
The result, according to Ellsworth, is that Musk wouldn't have had the concentrated, risk-tolerant capital required to launch Tesla in 2003.
He literally sank his entire fortune into keeping that electric car company alive when traditional banks wouldn't lend to him because they thought electric vehicles were a terrible investment.
And Ellsworth extends the logic forward. Let's say Tesla survives and goes public in 2010. Musk is now worth billions on paper. If the government hits him with a massive wealth tax again, forcing him to sell off his shares to pay the tax bill, he loses control of the company.
More importantly, he loses the leverage needed to fund his next insane venture, SpaceX.
And this is where Ellsworth highlights a specific, incredibly poignant moment in recent geopolitical history to validate his defense of billionaires. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of their first tactical moves was to try and destroy Ukraine's communication infrastructure.
The Ukrainian Prime Minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, urgently requested help on social media.
Because Elon Musk had retained vast, untapped wealth, he had been able to successfully fund and launch the Starlink satellite network. Within days, Musk was able to instantly deploy thousands of Starlink terminals to Ukraine, keeping their government, military, and civilians connected to the world during a catastrophic invasion.
It's an undeniable point. Ellsworth is essentially arguing, if we aggressively tax Elon Musk back in 2002 simply because we were scared of Stevenson's math, the world might not have had electric vehicles scaling up to fight climate change.
And Ukraine might have gone dark during a Russian invasion in 2022.
That is the core functional argument of free market capitalism. Extreme wealth is almost never sitting in a vault like Scrooge McDuck swimming in gold coins. It isn't dead capital.
It's working capital.
It is highly active. It is deployed into the economy to fund massive technological gambles, create hundreds of thousands of high-paying engineering jobs, and build world-changing infrastructure that governments are often too slow, too risk-averse, or too incompetent to build themselves.
Okay, I hear that. It's a powerful narrative defense. But I have to admit, I'm still stuck on Stevenson's math. Even if Musk is building literal rockets to Mars and saving countries with satellites, Stevenson is pointing out that the sheer, inescapable physics of compounding interest at the very top outpaces the physical reality of the planet.
You're saying the math doesn't care about the rockets.
Exactly. It's like a black hole. Doesn't matter how pretty the stars are that the black hole creates. Eventually, the gravity is so massive that it pulls everything into the event horizon anyway. If Musk's wealth grows at 20% a year, eventually he just owns everything.
You've just perfectly articulated the deepest ideological divide in macroeconomics today. What we are seeing in this debate is a fundamental clash between a static view of the economy and a dynamic view of the economy.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand this clearly. A static economy means they view wealth like a pizza, right?
Yes, the classic pizza analogy.
If the economy is a pizza with 8 slices, and Elon Musk uses compounding interest to buy up 3 of those slices, Mathematically, there is less pizza for me. It's a zero-sum game.
Exactly. That is the static view, which heavily informs Stevenson's perspective. The pie is fixed. There is a set amount of desirable land, a set number of houses in London or Austin, a set amount of resources.
And if billionaires consolidate their ownership over those fixed assets, everyone else is mathematically left fighting over the remaining crumbs.
But how does the dynamic view counter that? Are they saying Musk is building entirely new pizzerias?
Yes, precisely. The dynamic view, championed by Ellsworth and Nimitz, argues that human ingenuity means the pie is never fixed. When innovators deploy their concentrated capital, they aren't extracting slices from the existing pizza. They are baking massive, entirely new pies that never existed before.
Before Tesla, the electric vehicle supply chain was practically non-existent. Musk didn't steal value from Ford or General Motors. He expanded the total frontier of the automotive industry.
The wealth isn't extracted from the system. It expands the total carrying capacity of the system.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. But I have to ask, isn't it entirely possible that both of these worldviews are technically true at the exact same time?
Yes. And that is the terrifying nuance that gets completely lost in polarized, televised debates. Both mechanisms are operating simultaneously. Musk is undeniably innovating and expanding the technological pie.
But at the same time, the compounding effect of vast untaxed wealth does consolidate the ownership of fixed physical assets.
Explain how those two things coexist.
An innovator can build revolutionary rockets, creating massive new value. But that innovator and the institutional investors backing them still need a place to park their billions of dollars in profit.
And where do they park it?
In the static, fixed assets that Stevenson worries about. They buy up thousands of acres of land, they buy up commercial real estate, they buy out smaller competitors.
So you have a dynamic explosion of new technology, but the profits from that technology are used to relentlessly consolidate the ownership of the physical world.
Wow. So society gets the rockets, we get the satellites, we get the electric cars, but the working class might not actually be able to afford a physical house to watch the rockets launch from.
That is the brutal paradox of modern capitalism. The innovation does not necessarily negate the consolidation.
And when macroeconomic theories clash this hard, and the stakes for everyday people are this high, literally dictating whether they can afford a roof over their heads, the debate inevitably stops being about numbers on a spreadsheet and starts getting fiercely, fiercely personal.
Which brings us to the psychological dynamic of this entire ecosystem. The politic of envy, the moral purity tests, and the deeply personal clashes that erupt when we discuss who deserves what.
We see this ideological rhetoric playing out with real, tangible consequences. In the debate, Ellsworth brings up a fiery, highly publicized speech by New York State Assembly member Zohran Mamdani.
Right, that speech went viral.
It did. In this speech, Mamdani is incredibly aggressive, specifically targeting what he calls oligarchs and railing against the concept of the world's first trillionaire. He intentionally contrasts the soft hands of the billionaire class with the hungry children and undocumented workers suffering in his city.
It is a potent, emotionally charged narrative. But Ellsworth notes the real-world mechanical reaction to that kind of rhetoric. He argues that politicians like Mamdani think they're only attacking a handful of billionaires.
But in reality, capital is highly mobile and easily spooked.
Right. Ellsworth points out that it isn't just Elon Musk leaving. It is middle-class real estate investors, small business owners, and regional developers who look at places like New York with its aggressive rent controls, heavy bureaucracy, and openly anti-wealth political rhetoric, and they simply decide the friction isn't worth it.
They pack up their capital and move to business-friendly, lower-tax states like Florida or Texas. The rhetoric actually drives away the very investment needed to build housing and create jobs.
The rhetoric has severe economic consequences. But the absolute peak of the personal clash, the moment where the tension in the room is just palpable, happens between Piers Morgan and Gary Stevenson himself.
This was incredibly tense to watch. Piers goes on the offensive. He repeatedly and aggressively pressures Gary to reveal his exact personal net worth on national television.
Piers is deploying a classic media tactic, accusing the systemic critic of individual hypocrisy. His underlying logic is brutal, but effective.
He basically says to Stevenson, you wrote a best-selling book about taxing the rich. You have built a massive media career advocating for taking money from wealthy people.
Yet you are completely hiding your own vast wealth, and you are refusing to voluntarily write a check to the government for the 2% rate you want to force on everyone else.
And Gary gets visibly, genuinely frustrated by this line of attack. After severe, unrelenting pressure from Piers, he finally admits the truth. He confirms that he is a multimillionaire worth significantly more than £5 million.
He even estimates that he makes about 5% on his wealth annually, meaning he is actively participating in the very compounding passive income mechanism he claims is destroying society.
But when Piers challenges him to voluntarily give that 5% away, Stevenson flat out refuses.
His defense for refusing is fascinating and honestly a bit vulnerable. First, he says he refuses to give away his wealth because he wants to provide financial security for his future children.
Which is a very human response.
It is. He grew up working class, he knows what economic fear feels like, and he wants to shield his family from it. But his second, more philosophical defense is that he is campaigning for a systemic, legal change to the global tax code. He argues he is not running a personal charity.
In economic theory, Stevenson is entirely correct to separate individual moral action from structural policy. There is a vast mechanical difference between advocating for a systemic rule change and acting unilaterally while the old rules are still in place.
Like the speed limit analogy, right?
Exactly. If you believe the speed limit on a dangerous highway should legally be lowered from 70 to 50 miles per hour to save lives, you campaign to change the law.
Right.
But while you are campaigning, if everyone else on the highway is still driving 70, you don't unilaterally drive 50, you would get rear-ended and killed. You have to operate within the existing system until the systemic rules change for everyone simultaneously.
Stevenson is arguing that structural economic problems require structural, legally enforced solutions, not isolated acts of individual philanthropy that do nothing to change the math of the system.
That makes intellectual sense. But the public pressure clearly takes a massive toll on him. He looks at Piers and admits he is exhausted. He literally says, "I'm tired of the Gary Stevenson show."
He confesses that he is genuinely scared of the backlash from the incredibly powerful, wealthy people he is targeting. He says he doesn't want them to know where he lives, he doesn't want them knowing his exact finances, and he actually threatens to quit public campaigning altogether because the stress is destroying him.
It is a stark reminder of the human cost of entering these arenas. And he is facing incredibly heavy criticism from across the entire political spectrum, not just from conservatives like Piers or Ellsworth.
Yeah, Piers brings the receipts on that. He points out that while free market thinkers like former politician Rory Stewart have publicly dismissed Stevenson as a pseudo-economist, Gary is also taking fire from his own side.
From Richard Murphy, right?
Yes. Richard Murphy, a prominent left-wing figure from the Tax Justice Network, the exact kind of person you would think would ally with Gary, has publicly stated that Gary's specific plans are entirely unworkable, mathematically flawed, and a waste of time.
Which perfectly encapsulates the concept of the politics of envy that Ellsworth raised earlier. Policy debates involving wealth almost inevitably devolve into personal moral purity tests rather than logistical discussions.
So when we look at the psychology of that showdown, Piers sees Gary as a hypocrite who refuses to practice what he preaches, demanding sacrifice from others while hoarding his own millions.
But Gary sees Piers as intentionally dodging the terrifying mathematical reality of the wealth gap by choosing to attack the messenger instead of engaging with the data.
And the truth is, within the high-stakes ecosystem of public debate, both reactions are entirely valid. When you become the highly visible, wealthy face of a movement demanding financial sacrifice from a specific group of people, the public will naturally demand radical transparency and personal sacrifice from you.
But Gary's frustration that his ad hominem attackers are ignoring the structural math is equally valid.
It is incredibly deeply messy. We are looking at an economic system where the symptoms, the inability to afford a home, the rising cost of food, are universally felt by you, the listener.
But the diagnosis of why it's happening is violently contested. The proposed cures are viewed as either miraculous or completely toxic, and the leading doctors are essentially just yelling at each other in the operating room.
That is a remarkably accurate summary of modern macroeconomic discourse.
It really is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's synthesize exactly what we've unpacked here today. We have explored a stark, fundamental divide in how humans view capital. On one side, we have Gary Stevenson's math-driven worldview, the belief that vast, untaxed wealth accumulation is a relentless threat to society.
It is a static pie, and if we don't aggressively tax fortunes over $10 million, the compounding interest of the ultra-rich will eventually swallow the ability of the working class to own any physical assets at all.
And on the exact opposite side, we have Christian Nimitz and Tom Ellsworth, who view that exact same concentration of capital through a dynamic lens. To them, it is the essential engine of human innovation, the funder of space exploration, and the driver of job creation.
They argue that the real disease isn't wealth inequality, but heavy-handed government interference, inflation-driving stimulus, and local zoning regulations that literally make it illegal to build enough houses for the middle class.
It essentially boils down to a debate about whether society's primary goal should be to heavily tax the people building the rockets or completely deregulate the people trying to build more houses. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, our listener, with a new angle to ponder.
I love a good economic thought experiment. Let's hear it.
A thought experiment built on everything we've just discussed, but looking maybe 10 or 20 years into the future. We spent this entire hour debating how to handle the wealth generated by human labor, human innovators, and traditional capital markets. But consider the absolute tidal wave of artificial intelligence and advanced robotics that is currently hitting the global economy.
Oh, that changes everything.
As AI systems and automated humanoid robots begin to rapidly replace traditional human labor across all sectors, from copywriting and legal analysis to factory work and driving trucks, the sheer ability for the middle class to generate income by trading their time for wages might fundamentally shrink.
The decoupling of productivity from human labor.
Exactly. If human labor loses its economic value on a massive scale, that means traditional wages disappear. And if wages disappear, that leaves the ownership of physical assets and AI server farms as the only real source of wealth generation in society.
A profoundly sobering yet entirely plausible trajectory.
So here's the question for you to mull over on your commute. In a fully automated future, where capital completely detaches from labor, does the logistical nightmare of a wealth tax suddenly become a structural necessity we have to solve just to keep society from collapsing into feudalism?
Or, conversely, will boundless AI-driven economic growth create such massive, unimaginable abundance where energy and goods are virtually free that this entire debate over slicing the pie becomes completely obsolete?
It is the ultimate frontier of economic theory. If the fundamental nature of work mutates, the mechanics of how we distribute wealth must inevitably follow.
Exactly. When the underlying biology of the economy evolves into something entirely new, the rules of the game change forever.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the mechanics of wealth, inequality, and the precarious future of capitalism. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking past the rhetoric, and we will see you next time.